Welcome, everybody. It's Wednesday night again, and time to hear from another exciting, inspiring speaker. Tonight, we're going to hear from William Spear, who has become a friend and client of mine, and is a person I was inspired by long before I met him. So he has a long history of doing very intense work with individuals and with corporations. And I'm going to let him tell you the story of the Fortunate Blessings Foundation because he's quite a good storyteller and he can tell it better than I can. I would encourage you, as usual, to ask questions. William, do you prefer questions? You're going to engage, probably. Okay. So it will be an interactive presentation. And I really encourage you to sit forward, to listen, to allow yourself to be carried into the work that William does, because it is transformative. And I'll leave it at that. William, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Thank you for coming tonight. I am also a client. She is my client, so we just drop all that and we're becoming fast close friends. So I want to talk to you tonight and engage a sort of different part of you than you would normally have engaged. I want to talk to you about perception. And normally we use our cognitive brain, right, and our senses that organize thought and sort of put them into kind of a logical, linear fashion so we can kind of make sense of stuff. That's actually my so I forgot to turn my off on. But instead of hearing it from that place, see if you can find this place. Just go ahead and use your thumb. And it's actually sort of the xiphoid process, if you know a little bit about anatomy. It's that place, it's a little bit springy, right below your chest bone. It's got a little bit of pushback to it. So if you push into that hard enough, it would be kind of tender. You'll find that and make it a little bit tender with your thumb, if you wouldn't mind. Just go ahead and locate it inside your own being. So that when you take your thumb away, you actually feel it still there. You feel a little bit of pain there, or sensitivity there. So I want you to listen this evening from there. And I want you to breathe in through there. And I want you to imagine, if you can, what it might be like through there. So that would be perceiving the world through your heart instead of through your mind. It's been my experience that if we start to perceive the world through our hearts instead of through our mind, that we can use our mind to organize what our heart wants to do and take us in a direction that we really want to go, from a time before our mind started to form the intellect and started to come up with stories and reasons and excuses. And rather, from our feeling and sensing body, takes us into places that are quite different, sometimes not so comfortable, but quite different than the ones into which we walk with our thinking mind. So, where were you on 9/11? Yeah. What happened? Anybody? Just tell me where you were. Tell me how you felt. Tell me what happened. Tell me what went down. Yes.
I was in 5th grade. My school didn't tell us anything because I grew up in an area where a lot of parents information that we had that anything was going on was that an unusually large number of students were pulled out of school early that day.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't hear about anything until my mom told me after school.
And when you found out?
I don't think I really knew what it meant. I think I was too young to understand the global implications,
Sure.
but it
So you're
did,
like 10.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it did have a pretty big impact on my community,
Mm-hmm.
and still does in a way.
Mm-hmm. When did you start to feel something as opposed to think or observe? Did you
I think right away.
what you did?
I was scared.
Okay, good. So, afraid?
Yeah.
Good. Well, where were you?
I lived in Hong Kong at the time, so it was nighttime, and I was on the phone with my boyfriend, and he saw it on TV and told me.
Wow.
And so I ran around the house with my parents and my stepsister, and we turned the TV on. Spent the rest of the night watching.
Right. And what did you experience as you were watching? A lot of facts come, but much more than facts, you know. You're experiencing this in a different place than your brain, right?
Yeah.
What did you
It's
experience?
just, I was not really that something like that would happen, and trying to understand it.
Disbelief, right?
Yeah.
What else?
I was on the Upper East Side at school. I was in 10th grade, and we had just gotten out of class. I went to the computer lab, and everyone was talking about it. And things have happened like that were small little things. And so first we were just sort of saying, oh, the bridges are closed. We're not going to have soccer practice. Like, okay. But then we realized that, like, no, like the teachers and everybody were, super, like, distracted, and, people just had the TVs on in every room. And they basically, we couldn't talk about it in the halls because there were kindergartners around and, different age people. But everyone ended up leaving pretty early. People that lived in other boroughs came home with people that lived in Manhattan. So, like, my mom came to pick me up walking across the park with a bunch of boys from my twin brother's school. Then we walked again across the park to see, like, the smoke rising.
So smoke rising, you're seeing that. What's up? What's going on with you then?
It seemed like there was a really big, like, wound. Like, it seemed like a big wound or something, like, in my own home.
Someone else?
I was in Washington, D.C., and I was at work, and one of the other designers in the studio said, turn on the TV, somebody that's in the tower, one of the towers. And the designer across from me, her phone rang, and her brother-in-law was in one of the towers, and so she collapsed. And then the receptionist of the studio, husband worked in the Pentagon, and the phone rang, and he said, Pentagon's been hit. And it was really scary. So, at that point, a friend called and said, I'm getting your kids, because she knew I was downtown, and she was close, so she went to pick my kids from school. And I was talking to my husband, he was out in Virginia, and he said, I'm not coming back. He said, I'm going to stay out here because it's going to be too crazy. I'll just stay put for right now. You get home. So I got myself home. And then the really strange thing was it was such a beautiful, beautiful day.
Right. Blue sky.
It was the most beautiful blue sky. And because everybody had come home, the park was full of kids. It was wild. It was just such a strange experience. Anyway, it was, scary.
How many of you have been driving in the winter and you hit a patch of ice? And for a few seconds, what happens?
Scared.
You think you're gonna die?
Well, not immediately.
Feel it like power.
What's the first thing? You lose control. Okay? But so you're not going to die when you lose control. You're skidding and you're going so, and then you right the car and it's okay. Right? But now let's take that further. And now you're spinning and you're going to go into oncoming traffic or you're going to hit the concrete abutment. Then what's happening? Then you have the potential for physical injury. You're going to get hurt or you're going to die. So my work, and it's your work too, but you don't know it yet, is dealing with trauma. And slowly but surely, we are all under more and more increasing stress, which becomes various forms of, after an event, more stressful. And we call that post-traumatic stress. Like everybody experienced post-traumatic stress after 9/11. Everybody who's in the back seat of your car while you lose control is experiencing post-traumatic stress that evening. And that trauma isn't just loss of control. It's simply stress. But when you're spinning and when you fear physical injury or death, you cross a boundary from loss of control under stress into genuine traumatic event. And we are more and more experiencing genuine traumatic events, which change our perception because we really don't like to be out of control. That doesn't fit really well. Generally, when we're in control, we think we can kind of manage. Right? And as long as you know where you are, if you haven't gotten lost in the woods, it's okay. But when you get lost in the woods, if you're an adult, I was trekking once in the Himalayas with a group. I got separated from the group. And for a full day, I was alone in the Himalayas, trekking at 16,000 feet. There were no villages. There were just paths. You know, I was like completely out of control. But I was an adult, and so my rational mind was going, okay, this will probably work out. You know, it is a path. I'm going to run into a village sooner or later. Maybe I'll bump into some old people. What's the worst case scenario here? It's going to get cold. I'll kind of try to find a place to, you know, and that conversation went on. As it turned out, by the end of the day, I finally made it to a camp where everybody else had come, and I couldn't read the signals that they'd left on the path. But for that period of time, I actually didn't really cross over into, fear of physical harm or imminent death, because I'm an adult. But now, if I'm 6 years old and I'm walking in the woods, or I'm in the mall when I'm 4 years old, and I get lost from my parents, how many got separated from their parents when you were little? Right, like that. And how long did that last, right? If it lasted like 20 minutes or 5 minutes or 6 hours, to the point where the police took you into the child protection, I mean, there's this point where you end up with a traumatic event, and you end up with PTS, waiting to become D, the disorder. PTSD is not diagnosed right away. It's diagnosed about 60 days later. So where does all that energy that you just described when you experience seeing the towers or seeing the smoke or seeing the television or hearing the call of the Pentagon, where does it really end up if you have no control? Like if you go out of your mind, where does it end up? It ends up in your body. And where we hold those issues in our body ends up being kind of obscuration or blockage here. So we can't quite experience the world in the same way through this place. Our perception changes. Now, if you go back to some of the earliest thoughts you may recall, memories you may have of when that took place, some of it may be of such a nature that you wouldn't feel comfortable or safe sharing it in this room with strangers. even with some close friends. But back when you were 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, right, probably something happened. Something happened where you lost control. Something happened where you may have even feared something in terms of physical harm. It may have been a horrific human rights violation. It may have been something you witnessed. It may have been the loss of a parent. But it was a break, right, in the logical control that you thought about in terms of your life, being everything's okay. So does anyone like to share some experience sort of in that time zone? What happened when you were 5? What happened when you were 7? Anyone?
Does it have to be a separation from your parents?
Doesn't, but that can be one. Were you separated from your parents at a young age?
No, I had a moment where me and my sister were playing in the backyard. It was probably like 5, she was 6. She fell into the pool, and I had no idea what to do. She started drowning, but for some reason she like floated back up, and I like helped her get out of the pool. But for that split moment, I didn't know what to do, whether to leave her side and try to get my parents.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. When you tell that, can you feel that in your body still?
Yeah.
Right. It's actually reported from your brain because you have language. But even as you tell it, it was quite obvious that it's still in your body. So those memories we have in the business I'm in, we say the issues are in the tissues. They're still in our tissues. They're not just in our memory. Because our whole body has the cell memory. Every part of our body has cellular memory. Someone else? One more. Yes.
I grew up in Vietnam, and when I was 7, a neighbor, he overdosed on drugs, and he was in a gang, so his body was thrown just in front of our house, and that was the first thing we saw when we woke up, and we called the police.
You come out the door when you're 7 years old and you see a dead body.
Yeah, with the rest of our neighborhood being like surrounding it.
What's the feeling you have associated with that?
Well, right now I can hear my heart beating.
Yep.
Yeah. But I don't think I would. I'm just back then. Everyone just took me away after I saw it really quickly.
Come on in. Yeah, you can feel your heart beating. Not just hear your heart beating, you can feel it beating, right? Right behind that place I just pointed to. So when I was 5 years old, I was playing with my best friend who was 6. We used to play, I grew up on a cobblestone street, so the cars that would come on the street, they'd always drive very slowly, and it was kind of a very back street environment. So virtually everyone who drove on the street either lived on the street or had been on the street before, whether it was the mailman or the milkman or the paper boy, whoever. Mostly it was just neighbors. And we'd play in the street. We'd play the famous game, some of the adults in the room will know, stickball. The famous game of stickball. And we played like that all the time. So on a Friday afternoon, say goodbye, and say goodbye. So Saturday was no different than Friday. Saturday I went over to his house, which was unusually empty and dark. Knocked on the door, nobody was home. Knocked again, nobody was home. Went around the back. In those days, everybody's house was open in the back door. Walked in the kitchen, nobody's home. I yelled, nobody's there. So I came back, told my mom. She said, well, I don't know where they went. They must have gone out somewhere. I waited, never came home, whatever. Got busy with my family, dinner, forgot about it. Next morning, I get up like I did every morning to go play with him, go outside. Lots of cars outside. Lots of people coming up the stairs to his house, coming down the stairs. So I go over, knock on the door. Someone answers, dressed in like suit. Is Ty here? Can Ty come out to play? No, I'm sorry, he can't come out anymore. Well, why not? I'm sorry, he's just not here. Door closes. I run home. Ty, my good friend, died of leukemia the afternoon before. On Friday night, he cut himself. He had childhood leukemia, acute leukemia. They knew. Of course, he was trying to be treated, but in those days there was no real treatment. And if you didn't have enough blood platelets, when you cut yourself, you'd bleed to death. So he cut himself. They took him to the hospital late Friday night. They just piled him in the car and rushed him off. And they kept him overnight, and they prayed, and they tried everything they could, and sometime late Saturday morning, he died. So by Saturday afternoon, his family let everybody know, their family, their friends, and Sunday, everyone came to visit the bereaved parents. So my mother said, Ty went away. Didn't know really what to say to me. I'm 5. And for me, it was like, well, okay, when's he coming back? He's not coming back. What do you mean he's not coming back? Where did he go? Well, he went really far away. Well, why did he go alone? His parents are still here. Well, he went to a faraway place, but he's not coming back. I mean, the words weren't, and by the way, 5-year-olds don't really get death. If my mother had said he died, I would have said, oh, when is he coming back? Because 5-year-olds don't exactly know that death is permanent. So I would suggest that whatever traumas you didn't share, and certainly I know this for me and for thousands of people I've worked with, that was my fortunate blessing. The name of my foundation is Fortunate Blessings. And what we do is that we work with people who have been traumatized by various disasters or extremely traumatic events in their lives, particularly children, to help them get out of their bodies the memories before they become PTSD. So most notably what we do is we go to areas after earthquakes or tsunamis, floods or hurricanes, etc. And in some cases, acts of terror or political violence. And work with children who've been impacted by those events and help them make a lot of noise and get that stuff out of their body so it doesn't become systemic and turn into PTSD. So why is it my fortunate blessing? And what does it have to do with you? Somehow the work that you're going to do that's going to call you through your heart is going to be something horrible. And you will be challenged to turn that horrible thing into something great. Into something that makes a difference. Into something completely disruptive according to the way it used to be. So that it doesn't have to be like that anymore. For me, the traumas that stayed in my body and in my psyche for decades weren't resolved until I began to work with a phenomenal teacher who wrote a book in 1968 called On Death and Dying. Her name was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. If you want to read an extraordinary book, it is the cornerstone of all books around end-of-life care. Called On Death and Dying, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Now, what's interesting about a group of students in your age bracket is that probably not too many of you are going to bother to read that book because, you're 20-something. You're not going to die, right? I mean, you probably have 30 more years, right? 40, 20, 25 more years. You've already got it in your brain. Okay, 15, you have like 15 more years, okay? Of course, given your father's heart condition, your mother's breast cancer, you have 10 more years. You don't have to worry about, so you can make a 10, or you can make like a 5-year, it doesn't have to be a 10-year plan. You could because you could be safe, you'd have like at least 5 more years before you die, or like 3 anyway, right? So it's not going to happen in the next 3 years. Maybe it'll happen in 2 years, or maybe to die like tomorrow, are you? So here's the question I want you to take home. Is it a good day to die? If it's not, why not? What haven't you done? Why isn't it a good day to die? Would you have done something differently? Would you have said something more? Would you have communicated it? Would you have wasted less time? Would you have smoked less dope? Would you have spent, a little more time attending to your niece? Who the hell knows? You do, if you really let that question burn into your brain and you hear it through your heart. Is it a good day to die? So I asked a guy that once, about 25 years ago, who came to see me for a private consultation. He was a fairly successful businessman, and he was in Stockholm, in Sweden. And I went there because I started a foundation then which looked at the damage that was being done by low-frequency sonar that the Navy and other defense contractors were beaming through the ocean, bursting the eardrums of dolphins and marine mammals and whales who were being beached. And I thought that was pretty horrific. So I started something called the Silent Oceans Trust, which was a 5-year plan to try to make a difference that every time we talked about the oceans and pollution, we weren't just talking about fish pollution or water pollution or oil pollution. We were talking also about sound pollution. And in these days, nobody was talking about sound pollution that I was aware of. Dolphins' majestic nature, the whale, the orca, the oldest intelligent life, were being beached by the dozens because the eardrums were being exploded by low-frequency sonar. So I went to Stockholm, which is a kind of water world, to beg for change from some higher-up people with lots of money. And he wanted to see me personally for another issue. And after we talked about his issue for 15 minutes or so, I wanted to turn the tables on him, and I said, so is it a good day to die? Well, no. And I went, why not? He said, well, I'd like to improve my business. And I said, great. Let's see what we can do about that. Let's improve your business. What's up with your business? He said, well, every day I see about 40 million people. And I say to them, have a nice day. And I think I could do something more. And what? It's like, how the hell do you see 40 million people every day? What do you do? Who are you? He said, I'm the global director of strategy for McDonald's. So you see 40 million people every day. I get it. And then you teach your people at the end of your transaction to say, have a nice day. And he went, yeah, and I think I can do much more. Great. I'm game. Are you game? He said, sure. What game are you playing? I said, it's your choice, hardball or softball. He said, hardball. I said, great. If we play hardball, the meeting's over in 30 seconds. I'm game. I said, great. Quit fucking up my planet. Every time I go outside in the park, I see your wrappers in the woods. I see your containers on the side of the road. I see your trash, right, which is yours, even though someone bought it from you, yours, that you created in such a way that it stays there for another 2,000 years. Right? For God's sakes, please make it biodegradable. And I stood up and walked out of the room. So 2 years later, I got an email from him that said, done. And you will find out, if you do some Googling, that in 1994, all the other fast food groups followed suit, that all of their packaging goods became biodegradable. Why? Because I challenged him to say, is it a good day to die? And he knew there was something that he could do to make a difference. If he changed his perception and he didn't hear, is it a good day to die in his brain, just like you didn't. You like got it sort of in your heart, or somewhere in your body, or somewhere in your psyche that was a little uncomfortable. That transformation for Max Lederhausen, and you can look him up, M-A-T-S, Max Lederhausen, just like the German pants you wear, started because, BE-CAUSE.org. Be the cause. And it started for Max, his fortunate blessing. You'd think, I don't know what your lifestyle is and what you think about McDonald's, I think it's horrific. And he then ended up starting Chipotle, and now Roti, and a lot of other more conscious ways that we can spread food out into the world instead of just McDonald's. But he got out of the business and into the because business and stole this phrase. You can have it. Because he went with me the next day to, or he actually didn't come with me, a mutual friend came with me, to a large corporation that had offered some money for the Silent Oceans Trust. And although they didn't give it to us at the end, I said, okay, it's fine, but someday the values of your shareholders will become more important than the values of their shares. And because, which he started out of that kind of moniker, became a very powerful social innovation and change throughout a lot of businesses where people are starting to look at making a difference in the world and making money. Nothing wrong with that. And entrepreneurial, as long as you're not destroying the planet in the process, thank you very much, right? Or harming people. You can give people free choice. It can be vodka or it can be vitamins. You can have both. Or you can choose one and not the other. But you need to make kind of both available if you're thinking from this place. If you just want to keep people drunk and anesthetized and out of touch or stoned or whatever, then only give the vodka. So Fortunate Blessings for me became work in the field of not only end-of-life care after I studied and trained with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, but in working with people who were impacted by disasters. So in 2004, as many of you know, there was a rather large disaster, a tsunami, an earthquake in Sumatra that ended up in a tsunami. It was actually the biggest worldwide disaster, natural disaster in our history. Anybody know how many people were killed in that disaster? This is just a little more than 3 years after 9/11. How many people died in 9/11? About 3,000. Right? How many people died in the tsunami of 2004? 300,000. 300,000 people died in a flash, with waves coming and going. I took my eldest son, who's now 31, 2, lives in San Francisco, was in New York as an actor for 10 years, along with me to Sri Lanka, the island that we chose to go to rather than Thailand, because around the edge of the island were villages and government offices that were decimated. 70% of the government offices were wiped out, 30% of the government officials were killed, as opposed to Thailand, whose capital, Bangkok, was inland. So the next day they had the big machines, they had communications, they had the ability to respond to the disaster. Sri Lanka didn't. But let me tell you his fortunate blessing. We worked probably 2 weeks in Sri Lanka in relief camps with about 125, 140,000 children, doing what we call play shops, which you can read about on fortuneblessings.org. And toward the end of our stay there, some children who by this time were very attached to Jonah, my son, he's pretty charismatic and kind of playful and fun, came up to the van and were tugging at him. And most of the children couldn't speak any more English than, hello, hello, hello. You know, my name, hello, what's your name, what's your name? We're at the end of the entire English vocabulary that they had. So we got Jonah, and we got their names, and we got hello, hello, hello. And they kind of dragged him away. They dragged him out of the van, and they started to take him kind of down the road. We were getting ready to leave this relief camp, but okay, whatever, see you later. And off he went. And all of them, kind of 7, 8, 9, 10 of them, kind of around him, trying to hold onto his belt, and somebody holding onto the baby, finger, and somebody holding his elbow, and somebody grabbing the back of his pants, and just everybody wanted to kind of touch him. And they were moving up this road, and then they kind of disappeared, and then I could see them climbing up the hill. And then they went to the top of the hill, and they kind of disappeared. And I thought, okay, probably a fantastic view up there over the ocean. Right? So we wait, and like 45 minutes, 50 minutes. Nearly an hour later, finally, they come back. Jonah's face is completely different, really changed. And these children are now not quite so playful, joyful, bouncy, a little more somber. And they're walking very slowly, almost processional. And when they get back, he turns around and he goes like this, right? And something like that. And they all go, bye-bye, bye-bye, bye-bye. He got in the van, they slid the door, and the van closed. Put his head on my shoulder and started to weep. For 5 minutes, he just cried. I didn't need to know why, I was sure I would find out sooner or later. And another 5 minutes went by, he got his composure, and we rode for 10 minutes or so in silence. And then I turned to him and I said, so where'd you go? He said, well, they took me down the road and up this hill. We went to the top of the hill, and then we started to walk along this field, and I could see in the distance the ocean. And I thought it was like the most beautiful overlook. And when we got up there, they really changed. And we were walking through this field, and then we got to the edge of the cliff, and I was thinking, wow, this is so beautiful. It's so great. And I turned around, and they had all spread out in this field. And they were all kneeling down next to mounds. And they had their hands on the mounds. And I walked through the field, and each one of them tapped their hearts in the mound. And they said, my papa, my mama, my grandma mama. It was the burial place of all of their families at the top of the hill. And they waited until he just went to each grave and knelt down at each grave and touched the grave. And each person, each boy, smiled. And after he did that 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 times, they all stood up and more somber, came down the side of the road, walked back to the car. If your parents are alive, they might not be tomorrow. That might be one thing you can keep in mind through your heart, through the trauma that's in your body. So the suspended thing you have now going on, change it. Breathe through your heart. Breathe in through your heart. Right? You just lost your breath because it went in your body, because you got no place to put that in your brain. There isn't any place you can put that in your brain. So if over and over again we have a perception of the world with that kind of reality, that any day, any moment, we can lose everything we love, that everything that we think we can control goes out of control, that we actually are in this illusion of safety, that everything's okay, how would your life change? So some of you already know what your fortunate blessing is. So one of the gentlemen that I work with has worked with the CIA for 35 years. and he's quite an extraordinary man. He wrote a book called The Gift of Fear. His name is Gavin de Becker. His firm of 350 people guards some of the highest profile targets in the United States and overseas, who are perfect for terrorist attacks or for kidnapping. Captains of industry, he guards, and his firm guards, the Supreme Court justices. They guard 40 of 50 of the most important politicians, governors, senators, cabinet members, together with, of course, the Secret Service and others. He guards Oprah. He guards and guarded all of the Beatles. He guarded Steve Jobs. So his business is always having to look at situational awareness and being in the present moment at every second, because any second is the possibility for the last second. So he goes to the CIA once a year and talks to the agents about what it means to be in the present and to operate from your feeling body, from your sensing body, not from your brain. Yes, you use your brain, but it is as basically your instinct or your intuition. And he'll refer to that in this 3 minutes or 4 minutes that I want you to watch in a number of ways when he tells this story. At the end of an hour and a half talk, some of which was redacted, but most of which I got unclassified so I could show it to you from the CIA about a particular experience that he had.
Level of suffering on earth is admirable. Now, I shared some lessons I learned from many cases, and I want to tell you one last case that taught me a lot. And I think you'll see the wisdom of this. The ending is embedded in the beginning. I was watching.
Oh, really? How's that happen?
Oh, it just looks like it's lost.
No, it just falls. Okay. Oh, now it's the very beginning. Anyway, out of control.
His behavior as well. Might he charge her to get the gun away from her? I'm very proud to be part of that work, and I think it is a great credit that to the agency as well, that you're trained to deal with individuals, trained to think about the kinds of concepts we've talked about, which are not relevant to making predictions about countries, but are highly relevant to making predictions about people. Reducing the level of suffering on earth is admirable. Now, I shared some lessons I learned from many cases, and I want to tell you one last case that taught me a lot. And I think you'll see the wisdom of this. The ending is embedded in the beginning. I was watching, a woman was holding a firearm, handgun, aiming it at a man, her husband, in a room, and I was standing off to the side in a doorway. And she was saying, "This time I'm really going to kill you. This time I'm really going to kill you." And I didn't listen to the words. I looked at the actions, because it was my job, as it had been many times before, and it would be many times again in my career, to decide whether a homicide was about to happen. And I watched her, and I saw different pre-incident indicators. At one point, she put her finger on the hammer of the gun. An obvious pre-incident indicator would be cocking the gun. At another point, she used the gun to move the hair out of her eyes. And then I had to predict the man's behavior as well. Might he charge her to get the gun away from her? And I watched all of these signals. I saw a police car go by the window outside. That's an irrelevant detail. You have to discard the irrelevant and stay on the relevant. So that goes, even though you think, oh, police car, and I'm standing here, and this situation might occur, but you have to let that go. And I watched all of these pre-incident indicators, and I didn't think that violence was going to happen. You know, I thought it was the last thing that this woman would ever do, but for some people it is the last thing that they do. And then I saw one pre-incident indicator that changed everything for me. She backed up. She backed away from him. And that was an important indicator to me because guns are not intimate weapons. When people shoot people, they want distance between them. And I quickly acted on my new prediction that she was going to shoot him. And I backed out of the room. Neither of the people saw me. And I went through the kitchen, saw something boiling over on the stove, ignored that. You have to discard the irrelevant. And I was looking for a young girl who was in the house, 2 years old. My plan was to take her out of the house, out the back door. And I came into the bedroom, and there she was, and I heard the first shot. And she sat up in her bed, the little girl. And then I heard many more shots. Now, at 2 years old, she did not know enough to be afraid or to understand what was going on. But I was 10 years old. And I knew all about these things already. And that case, 40 some odd years ago, is part of why I'm so proud to be here talking about the subjects I'm talking about, and why I'm so grateful that I can make some contribution. And I thank you all very much for including me. I don't feel like I gave a talk. I feel like you gave an opportunity. And I really, it's my deepest hope that people here take any.
He was 10. That was his little sister. His mother killed his father. And he turned his life into protecting other people and becoming probably the world's most expert in kidnapping, terror, and security. That's a fortunate blessing. It's not a fortunate blessing when you're 10, any more than my losing my best friend, or you're seeing a dead body when you're 7, or you're having your experience, or you're yours, or anybody who shared or didn't. But does anyone have a sense of what might be your fortunate blessing? Please.
About 2 months ago, a very good childhood friend of mine was, she was leaving a party, by the Midtown Tunnel, not too late at night on a Friday night, and she was run over by a garbage truck and was on life support until the following Monday, and then declared brain dead and passed away. And I think for me, that was the first time in my life that I learned really that we're not immortal, or I'm not going to live forever, and it completely changed my entire outlook on the world. And I don't know what I'm going to do with that going forward, but something.
Was she on a bike?
No, she's walking. No one really knows exactly what happened, but no criminal activity took place. The driver had the right of way. He stopped. He took her to the hospital. She had no identification on her, but the police were there for a while. And then eventually her family's contacted.
Everybody knows what Mothers Against Drunk Driving is, right? MAD. In high school, when you grew up, if you did in the United States, how many of you knew about MAD? But everybody, right? You've kind of heard of that. Where'd it come from? One mother whose daughter was killed by a drunk driver. And she became the unstoppable force of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. That's the first blessing. is what one person could do and did do, thinking about how urgent the message of changing our direction is. Not only to look at the reality of what's going on in the world now, but to somehow envision a world which could be very different than it is, and how to communicate that visually through an extraordinary sizzler of a video called 4 Years Ago. So it'd be great if I had the time to spend with each of you individually and give you the kind of is it a good day to die question and what you're going to do, to change a big part of our culture by creating biodegradable packaging materials, or even creating with your own particular skill set, a video that powerful to inspire people, or walk into those kind of dark places where there's a lot more chunks of gold than there are in the visible world. Reaching for those, you have to kind of get your hands dirty and reach into the muck, and then you don't let go once you find that chunk of gold. Everyone I've ever worked with who survived life-threatening illness, and I've worked with thousands of people who transformed themselves even though they had major life-threatening illness, stage 4 cancers, given 3 months to live, etc., have one thing in common. It wasn't that they ate brown rice, or that they chewed really well, or that they grade every morning, or they took vitamins, or they didn't cheat on their taxes, or they went to church, or it wasn't any of those things. It was that somewhere along the line, they were able to say that what happened to them was a fortunate blessing. It actually became an opportunity for them to stop and self-reflect and change themselves, reinvent themselves, rather than die in the misery of this condition, right, and see themselves as victims. So we all have these horrible things that happen. Sometimes a room full of 50-somethings, 60-somethings come a little more quickly with those things that happened when they were children. And they look back and they didn't spend their 20s or 30s or 40s. But teaching as I have more recently, the last 5, 6, 7 years, to college students, master's degree students in different programs, it's a new opportunity for me. It's a new kind of environment, a milieu to put that question out. What's your fortunate blessing? And what will you do with it? It's not like the radiologist comes out of the dark room and hands you the diagnosis and says, well, you have cancer, and you're going to go, yay, that's the best thing that ever happened to me. It doesn't happen quite that quickly. It took every one of those people who survived a long time to transform it into a fortunate blessing. But your worst nightmare, the most horrible thing that ever happened, the loss of your daughter from a drunk driver, watching your mother kill your father. I mean, how much more horrible can we get in the story? Right? Became these people's fortunate blessing. So I'll show you one more little kind of set of slides. Any questions so far or interaction, and then we'll have more of those questions and interaction. Comments? I think everybody knows who that is. We're such pawns. We're such easily manipulated dead meat in the eyes of the media, in the eyes of most of Madison Avenue, in the eyes of the troublemakers who just want to empty your wallets and distract you from your real purpose and make a difference in the world. And a lot of this happens through the news, because the news 24-hour cycle now is so riveting. I worked with a guy today, and when we finished at 3 o'clock, he's a fairly successful financier. I knew he knew a fair amount about what was happening in the markets. So I said to him, what did the markets do today? And he said, oh, they're fine. I said, did you have a sense that anything was going to happen? He said, it's such a charade. None of those guys would ever let this happen in the final hour. It would be political suicide. I never lost a night of sleep. But what has happened to most of us is that we've been riveted to the news, and every day we're like looking, the deal's made, and the deal's not made, and the deal's made, and the deal's not made, and Bonner did this, and Obama did that, and the Democrats did this, and the Republican Ted Cruz said this, and that, right? And you're on TV, and the ads are selling, and the newspapers are coming off the stands, and everybody's like completely engaged, right? So you can watch the drug ads, and the car ads, and the Pepsi ads, and the ads for the next TV show, and The Good Wife, and Homeland, because you're like right there, because there's like something going on. This is from Shipping News, where Kevin Spacey's just taken a job as a reporter in a New England town, and he's a young kind of rookie, and and a very seasoned reporter who he's going to take a walk with is giving him a little test saying, like, well, how would you handle this? You don't need to turn the lights off in this.
I need a reporter. Finding the center of your story, the beating heart. That's what makes a reporter. What do you see? Tell me the headline. Horizon fills with dark clouds. Imminent storm threatens village. But what if no storm comes? Then they've spared from deadly storm. This storm.
That was the news in the last 2 months. It's like no more complicated than that. Village Fair. We just made it. We just signed the deal in time. We didn't go over the cliff. Oh boy, that's close. So what were you doing in those 2 months? Watching TV all the time, buying newspapers? I hope not. I have one other piece, and I'll share it, but I'd like to take your questions, if you'd like, about your work, my work, the work, this life. Whatever.
So does your organization, do you get called in by groups of people, or you just show up?
No, we get called, like we're off to Kenya after the mall shooting in about 2 weeks. We were called by the President of Kenya and U.S. Ambassador. We're known and really have a track record for working with extreme cases of trauma, most often natural disasters, so we're hosted by the medical schools. And we train people on the ground to build capacity.
Did you work with the kids in Connecticut?
That was, as could be expected, a kind of feeding frenzy. And unfortunately for the children, it became a soapbox for gun control. I'm totally into gun control. I think it's great. We should have much more gun control, regulations and awareness. But at the expense of children's mental health and their emotional problems and their trauma, the whole conversation around gun control trumped all the other care that could be given. And from the top down, from the President's Council on Mental Health and the Senate, I was with Richard Blumenthal, who's a senator, senior senator from Connecticut, and Chris Murphy, who's the new senator, Governor Malloy, and a man named Jonathan Best, who is the head of emergency disaster response, when the school was open the next day. I don't think I've ever seen anything as bad as that. What happened in Kenya, you don't know, because all you know is the news. But what happened in Kenya was worse than that, and I haven't seen it yet, but I understand what took place there. They wouldn't report it. They wouldn't really tell you. It was too horrific. There were 400 children in the mall. They were at a cooking demonstration being given by the utility companies. And when the terrorists came in who had formed a business and took a store there a year before, they waited for that day for the children to arrive. Because the Somalian terrorists wanted to kill children. That was their goal. They wanted to kill as many children as possible. Because the Kenyan government had sent troops into Somalia and killed families. And so some of the witnesses heard terrorists, as they were firing their guns, and yelled, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Don't kill the children. Don't kill the children." And the terrorists responded, "Why should I not kill your children? You killed my children." And some of the survivors told these kinds of stories. There were horrific things that took place there. So governments call us, or organizations call us. We train or work with Doctors Without Borders and Mercy Corps or others to build capacity among other staff. The initiative is called Second Response. We're not the first responders. We don't go right away. We go like a month later.
Do you ever focus on what's going on in the terrorists' minds? Do you like try to understand why people do these kind of things?
Well, it's a very good question. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross kind of took that down the road a bit because before she wrote the book on Death and Dying, and since then 25 books, she's deceased about 4 or 5 years ago. She was one of the people who liberated the camps in Auschwitz and throughout Poland and Hungary and other places. And she, on the days when the camps were liberated, sat with other nurses and doctors on a railroad tie, weeping as they were taking care of the men and women who, at 50, 60, 70 pounds were coming out of the camps. And of course, just in disbelief that this kind of horror could have taken place and this kind of treatment could have gone down. After they finished the triage and taking care of people and loading them into vehicles to take them away, a group of them were left sitting. And they noticed that there was a car, a railroad car, a gigantic box car. And they looked at it and they thought, oh my God, And so they decided we have to open it. And they were a little scared what was going to find inside, but they opened it and it was full of children's clothing, shoes and hats and shirts and pants, completely full. And she broke down and cried, and she said she cried for 2 months. And basically she asked herself this question: how could a Lord, a God, a creator, the universe make a heart like Mother Teresa and a heart like the SS, Hitler, or others? How could a human being embody those? And she began to really examine her own darkest places. And she realized that we all have the potential to do anything. We all have tremendous power in our emotion. And it's inside us. People commit suicide because there's no future. If you see some future, you don't take your life, right? But when there's nothing beyond now, you're certainly willing to put on a vest and, or put a gun in your mouth or take pills or whatever, kill yourself, take your own life. But if you see no future also for your whole family or for the culture in which you live and the kind of injustice that is in your story, in your reality, such impoverished experiences in your community, in your culture, then you'll put on a vest, also particularly with an extremist perspective of what may lie on the other side if I do this in the name of a God, in the name of a religious cause, in the name of the righteousness of what God is telling me to do. You'll put on a vest and blow up a market. So I don't think about the acts per se as much as I think about the people who had hopelessness. They had no future. They knew they were going to die. They didn't expect to accomplish this and walk away. They knew they were going to be killed, as almost everyone did who walked into a school and started firing. Many of them took their own lives after they did it, as you know. And of course, all those guys who flew the planes into the trade centers did it as a service, if you will, but they saw no future. So rewind in their lives, like what's in their head. It's not as much the act of what they did, but who they are. They're other human beings who I can still find some compassion for. I can't accept their action. I would condemn it. But I can bow to the reality of their injustice and the life they lived to the point of understanding. Right? craziness. I was in Bosnia and Herzegovina all during the Baltic Wars in the 90s, in and out of relief camps there. Played basketball one afternoon with 4 guys who had their legs cut off with chainsaws. They were strapped to these boards that you could go under cars with. They were really good blues players. Beat me, and they were like moving all around. And I came back from that experience. I met women who took their daughters' lives to prevent them from being raped. Just horrific, incredible, crazy things. I came back from that and went to a Buddhist retreat with one of my teachers. And I asked that question, kind of, it's like, I had to go back to Bosnia. How can I continue this? It's like, it's driving me crazy. I can't sleep at night. I've got no place for it. And before he answered, it was a long, long, long pause, and he just sat in the room, and everybody just listened to their own heartbeats. And he took a really deep breath, and he said, "Please get spacious." That was me saying to you, breathe through your heart, open. And then he said again, open up, open up, open up. And then he said, one-on-one you can work, but in groups you can't. Because when you have lots of people, numbers don't mean anything. Right? 50,000 people died. Right? 8,000 people died. 45 people were killed. But when it's your brother, or your son, or your neighbor, or your father, it really matters. So his suggestion was, the insanity lies in the masses, but it doesn't lie in the heart of the individual. One-on-one you can talk heart to heart. Don't go back into situations where you're just with groups. Get into situations where you're one-on-one and talk to people heart to heart about their lives.
One question. I heard Joan Halifax actually give a talk, and someone asked about compassion fatigue.
Uh-huh.
And she said, I don't actually like the term because I believe there is no end. You can have unlimited compassion.
Right.
But she was recognizing this effect of, it's first of all, it's hard to hear all of these things, to deal with these realities. And then also because of the way the news, like storm threatens, all the time, it's like at a certain point you numb out.
Right.
But this is a room full of people who are wanting to help, in whatever industry or in whatever capacity, wanting to make things better. So I think you were just giving some, but I mean, a little bit of advice about what compassion fatigue might be and like how to.
That's great.
Yeah.
So remember when I got lost in the Himalayas? I was with Joan Halifax. I went to Tibet in 2000. Dear friend, I've taught at Upaya, which is a Buddhist center, and she is the Roshi. So for me, compassion fatigue is unresolved grief. The world's a really, really, really sad place. I mean, come on. It's really sad. And how do you get past that sadness? What do you do when you're sad? How do you let go? What's the human response? Not yet. Eventually, but what's the human response? You cry, right? You weep. You just let go. But when you go, I can't stand it anymore, it's unresolved grief. During the 80s, when men were dying with AIDS, and eventually women were dying with AIDS, and children were dying with AIDS, those of us in New York who were working with GMHC, I was working when it was called Gay-Related Immune Deficiency, GRID. Okay, that was the first name, because nobody knew what it was. And there were like 3, 4, 5 funerals every week. Right? And you'd see people at funerals, like you'd go to one at 10 o'clock in the morning and one at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you'd see the same people there. Right? And you'd like look at each other. You'd already cried your eyes out from 10 to 12, and you'd gone home and you'd taken a shower and you'd eat and you'd did some little work, and then you go to another funeral at 4 o'clock. It's like, what, are you going to cry again? People got to this point where you're going, what's the use? It's like, what's the use? Life is ridiculous. Everybody we love is dying. That's a kind of compassion fatigue, right? So here's my own sort of metaphor and feeling about this. In Chinese medicine, in the center of your palm, you have what's called the heart governor point. If you press it right into the deep push and push toward your middle finger, kind of in there, press pretty hard, press pretty deep. That point in Chinese is called palace of weariness. Okay? It is the weariness of the heart. It shouldn't hurt. But if it's tender, and you feel it, then your heart is still tender. Okay? So in prayer, or in many traditions, we go like this. Right? That's sort of like our heart. Because the Chinese felt that our heart meridian actually is this. Our whole energy is this. If you watch Superman 1, Glenn Ford was Christopher Reeve's father. And there's a brilliant example of what it looks like to have a heart attack. After Christopher Reeve goes to visit his father, he drives off, and then Glenn Ford's like waving goodbye to him, and then he goes, you can like see the energy in his chest going down the inside of his arm, shaking, and then out his baby finger. And people with heart attacks will tell you that they could feel the energy leaving their body down their arm through their baby finger. So many children know, who have grown up in families where acupuncturists practice, that if somebody has a heart attack, you squeeze their baby finger like for first aid, like a tube of toothpaste to get the energy back in. It's a good first aid trick. If you see someone having a heart attack, do it. Don't hesitate. Just squeeze it hard and squeeze that energy back into their heart. It's just as good as CPR, I promise you. It's really extraordinarily powerful to do. So here's this heart. Okay? When you cry, what happens to your heart? The edges sort of break down. Right? The edges of your heart just sort of melt, and you cry, and you kind of get to be a puddle. But then you gather yourself back together. Pretty much every time you cry real tears from grief, not over yourself, okay? Right? Oh, he never called back. That doesn't count. Right? But, you know, you cry because some of the stories I told you are worthy of tears, right? And like my son, you cry real tears of grief and of loss and of the sadness, which is the reality of the world in which we live. You break down the edges of your heart, and then when you reform it, it's a little bigger. And so when it gets a little bigger, you can take a little more in. And then when you see something horrific, you cry again, and you break down because you can't contain that, and you melt the edges of your heart. And then you slowly reconstruct it, and it gets a little bigger. So how big's your heart? Our concept is that our heart is just sort of this big. But this is our heart. That's how big your heart is. You have plenty of space to be compassionate. But you have to break down the edges of your heart and weep. And face that you might get run over tonight. Or your parents might. Or your best friend might. Just that quickly. It's over. If you cry and you weep and you open your heart, the only way you're going to build a bigger heart is to breathe through here. And when you breathe through there, you get a little kind of balloon space. And then you cry again. For sure you will. You know Patch Adams? It was the Robin Williams movie. Well, Patch is a real guy. I've done a lot of work with him. He's a fantastic healer. Very interesting guy to hear speak. The first time I saw Patch Adams, he came into an auditorium of about 300 people. And he talked for about 10 minutes about his hospital and about his work. This is long before the movie. And then he had this woman who had come with him. And he said, well, so I want to introduce Melba. Melba, will you come up? So Melba comes up. Melba's like a morbidly obese African American woman. She's 450 pounds. And she's Gunda, right? And there's like not a stool that you could sit on, but it would break, right? So Melba's like standing here like a sumo wrestler, and she's got this dour look, right? And Patch says, so Melba's one of our partners and one of our volunteers. She's been working with us for a couple of years. She's so valuable. She's so great. Really wonderful person. And what she likes are good, like short one-liner jokes. Okay? And she's like standing there like, thinking, sure doesn't show, right? So he goes, so does anybody have a joke, And he says, keep it clean. No dirty jokes. Just a good one-liner, right? And so I remember the first joke that somebody told, which was, how do you catch a polar bear? So Melba goes, how? And the guy who says this says, well, what you do is you cut a hole in the ice. And polar bears really like peas. So what you do is you line up peas around the hole. And then when the polar bear comes to take a pee, you kick him in the ice hole. So that was a joke. And Melba goes, and she completely explodes in a way that exploded everyone in the room. I mean, this laugh was bellows, just like an earthquake and a wave of energy that came over the room, which caused everybody to laugh. And when people start laughing, you hear other people's way of laughing, right? And she couldn't stop laughing. And then everybody was laughing. I was cracking up. My cheeks were hurting. People were on the floor, pounding the floor, right? And finally, all got together after 2 minutes. And then Mel was like, who's got another one? Right? And somebody else does another joke. And she explodes again. It was hysterical. Amazing. So here's what Patch Adams does to make his heart big. Every morning, he looks at pictures. In those days, it was pictures of children from Bangladesh who were so thin and starving on withered breasts of their mother that they were about to die from malnutrition with big swollen bellies. By the way, while we're sitting here today, 40,000 children died of malnutrition. Just a little factoid for you. 40,000 children died without food in the world today. So he would look at pictures of dying children every morning and pictures of horror over and over again until it made him cry. And he would finally weep. And he would weep, and he would weep, and it would get him crying, and then it would take him 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and then he'd finally catch his breath, and he'd put the picture back on his altar, and then he'd go to work. That's what he had to work every day. With so much joy and so much happiness. So yeah, see the beauty. But first you gotta let go. First you gotta break down. First you gotta dissolve the edges. And that's why I like the work that I do. I've never found a better way to develop myself. It's kind of selfish in that sense. But it's the dark place. It's the shadow. I like all the other stuff too. I like sitting listening to Spotify all day, when I'm working, and my kids are engaged with me in many ways that are not unlike what you're spending your day doing. But I also can't work at Barnes & Noble. I can't do the restaurant cook thing. I always wanted to play basketball, but that was kind of hell. So I work in the dark places. Any other questions?
What happens if you don't cry?
You'll probably get to this point where you'll die of sadness. When we went to Japan after Fukushima, we trained 70 nurses in the Nurses Association about 2 hours west of Tokyo. who were going to be the ones to go throughout the country and help children, particularly in the Northeast. And those kids had to have nurses who knew how to express their emotion. But let me demonstrate to you what the typical, I'll say not even the typical, the most extremely expressive nurse in the group, which was fairly typical of the entire group, who was, I'm going to guess, 45 or 50, looked like when she expressed an emotion. Okay? Looked like this. That's it. Nothing else. So when we do a training, we do 4 hours. And at the end of 2 hours, the cognitive didactic part's done, and then we break, and then we do an exercise. And had this room not been full of chairs, we would have done it in this room, and we would have made a lot of noise and jumped up and down and wiggled and done some funny things. And we got 70 nurses from Japan to do that for an hour. And they let it go. In every way, shape, or form. They were on the floor rolling around pretending to be octopuses. They were wiggling, pretending to be Tyrannosaurus Rex. They were chasing each other around, pretending to be dragons. They were screaming in fear and terror. They were laughing as hard as they could. They were crying uncontrollably, etc., etc., etc. All very fast, very rapid. That's what we do in these play shops and the training. And at the end of it, the kind of top down was all of them just said, I don't know, I don't know, I'm prepared. They were like completely astounded because they weren't in their heads, they were in their bodies. And then the translator said to us afterwards, never in a million years would they have ever expected a group of 70 Japanese nurses to act like that. It ain't hard to cry. It wouldn't be hard. It's kind of like what reminds me of when I was in college. There was a very macho guy who was sort of one of the guys in our group I hung out with a lot and drank. We were out one night, kicking back some beers, and somehow the conversation came around to skydiving, which is something I do too. Bizarre, but I jump with my kids. And in those days, it never occurred to me I'd ever skydive or I'd ever want to. So, I'm like 19 or 20, and we're talking about skydiving. And this one very serious guy, super buff, and weightlifter, football player, very serious. I'm sure he ended up a Marine, not a Navy SEAL or something. Brian. And we're talking. And you're asking, do you ever do it? Do you ever do it? So we got to Brian. Brian, do you ever go skydiving? Do you ever jump? He went, yeah. I said, what was it like? He said, filled my pants. Just completely scared the shit out of him. Really? Oh my God, such a tough guy. No, not at all.
Anybody else? How did you awaken?
How did I awaken? How did I awaken?
I told you to ask this question.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I still can't say that this isn't a dream. So, the distinction is if I'm more awake or that there's only an on-off switch. I was walking down the street one time in Copenhagen. I went to Copenhagen with the Grateful Dead in 1972. What? So,
I'm sure you needed some help.
yeah. And I was shooting video for the Dead on the road. Anyway, I ended up living in Denmark for a couple of years. And I was 260 pounds. This is counterculture hippie you're looking at. So my hair was down to my waist. I was pretty much a stand-in for Jerry Garcia. Big, fat belly, gigantic beard. long hair, gray, patched jeans that are in the museum in Copenhagen, by the way. My jeans are still there. And anyway, I'm walking down the street one day and collapsed and ended up getting taken to the emergency room and was told that I had full renal failure and that I had to go on dialysis in order to survive. So kind of weighed that in my mind in the middle of the night before my first morning dialysis treatment and realized that the dialysis machine was going to be my best friend for the rest of my life. I didn't like that idea. So I was living with the road manager of the Rolling Stones in Copenhagen in this little urban farm. And I walked out of the hospital in the middle of the night against doctor's orders. Went to an acupuncturist, changed my diet, completely changed my life. Lost 100 pounds in 9 months. Became macrobiotic. Just totally reinvented myself. So much that when I came back to the States about a year and a half later, my mother walked by me in the airport. She did not know who I was. And even when you stopped, she just went, and just invented. So that was sort of awake, because it was a life-threatening illness. It was really like a challenge to change or leave the planet. But to be fair, I think my answer to that would be I could afford to be so much more awake. It's what happens when you pass a certain number on the race. You start to realize both my parents who passed away, they both died in my arms. When you get to the place where you hold enough people in your arms as they pass away, you realize your mortality, and you don't sit around much. My father was busy until he was 86, working still every day, and he should have retired by their standards, working for Prudential Beach as a banker. When he was 65 and 70, 75. So when he turned 80, they tried to give him a retirement party, with a watch and a whole 9 yards, and so he went to the party, got the watch, and went to work on Monday. And a couple weeks later, I said, Dad, why don't you retire? And he looked at me, he said, what am I going to do, sit around and watch Oprah all day? And it was a great answer. I'm not retiring. I have no interest to. I can't imagine sitting around not doing something. And that would be toward getting more awake. So
I'm curious about the people that you train.
Yeah.
What is it a practice that they then hold on to?
Yes,
They
it's a
hold
practice
on to, and then
they can then use with other children.
Okay. And do you, just in terms of, we should have a map of where you've been.
A map of where I've been. There's been almost a place I haven't been yet. I haven't been to Antarctica. Here's a cool thing that I haven't been. So, like I've pretty much traveled all over the world a lot. I have more frequent flyer miles than probably anyone you know. And loved it. Loved traveling. Taught in world capitals and continents and in the middle of Java, in the middle of Fiji, in the middle of lots of places that those people have never been as well. There have been disasters and floods and earthquakes and stuff. I've never been to Paris. Right? It's like, I know London like the back of my hand. I know London as well as I know New York, and I know New York real well. It's just, I don't know, Paris hasn't had any earthquakes or I don't know, they're like, maybe they're all real happy. Yeah.
Isn't it the city of light?
It's the city of light. Oh, very interesting. I can't go there. I go to the city of dark.
You have to take that's too bright.
Yes.
So how do you deal with the trauma that comes from something that is ongoing? That, for example, mutilation is embedded in
The trauma of something that is ongoing, and so you kind of prepare for it. An earthquake has a beginning and an end. Right? Yes, there's aftershocks. Tsunami has a beginning and a flood situation, which is a rare, like in Boulder, Colorado, 1,000-year flood has a beginning and end. But the repetitive, kind of unrelenting, non-stop traumas tend to be human-caused, like war. So veterans who have been in situations where they're deployed and are under fire and are traumatized, right? They never have any relief. They're always in harm's way. Right? And that's PTSD. We don't work with PTSD. We prevent it. The accepted norm is after a traumatic event, after an earthquake, after a flood or whatever it is, then 10% of those impacted will develop PTSD. 90% will find the normal coping mechanisms. I categorically reject that notion. And as a disruptor, I'm interested in going in the period where there's post-traumatic stress before the disorder emerges. 60 days, 80 days, 100 days later. And unfortunately, what's done with the first responders is what are called psychological first aid or crisis counseling. And those are very nice, let's talk about what happened sessions, but they're palliative care. And what that means is, we make you feel better. And that's very nice to feel better, but it doesn't prevent PTSD. Because the stress isn't in your brain. You can't talk it out. It's in your body. The issues are in the tissues. So we get people up moving and shaking, and we develop what occurs to children as games, but they're actually very carefully crafted exercise to help them release grief and fear and anger. When you're under constant threat of trauma repetitively, right, because you're looking at your life in danger or physical harm every day, day after day, as a soldier, or as a child living in a village where someone could come from the next village with machetes and attack the village. You're in that constant state. Right? You can't intervene. You're just dealing constantly with PTSD. And our group and the work we do is not about PTSD treatments. It's very, very difficult. We prevent PTSD before.
I just have a question in relation to that. How do you determine the amount of time that you spend with each community, and how do you then sort of follow if they, at what point will it stop to develop into PTSD?
So we went back to Sri Lanka 8 times after that first time in 2004. And the second time we went, we integrated our protocols into the school system. And the third time we kind of checked on the control group and watched, as well as looked at those who we trained, introduced new situational analysis to younger kids. And so it becomes part of their culture. It's part of the Japanese school system now. It's part of the Samoan school system. It's in Sri Lanka. When we get back from Kenya, it'll be part of Kenya as well. But the real purpose for us is to develop capacity on the ground so that we don't have to go. We used to be responsive agency, that every time the ground shake, I would say, oh, okay, I'm out of here. And this gets a little tiring. And we realized we could be proactive, we could be preemptive. So now we're training in advance as well. So hopefully you go back once or twice or 3 times, develop enough caregivers who have the capacity to do what you're doing, and then they integrate it into the children's kind of growth curriculum, shall we say. Because they're games. That's all they are. It's non-verbal. It's not a counseling situation. Yep.
Have you worked with adults like those children that have traumatic events?
Sure.
And it's been decades since.
Yeah, they have found coping mechanisms, and most of them have various kinds of anxiety disorders, but those with PTSD are difficult to work with. We'll work one-on-one with them. I do that in my private practice. But as a group setting, it's hard to work. This is typical for veterans groups, for example, or survivors of incest, or others that have a particular identity. Group sessions and group work is helpful. I don't do that kind of group work. I'll do one-on-one work. When we go in to train, of course, those nurses many of them came and said quietly, I haven't cried since the tsunami when my sister died. I haven't been able to let go. Thank you very much. It was really helpful for me to cry. This kind of beautiful thing would happen. There's an adult, right? Now, if we go back, we went to Fukushima 8 months later, right, we saw some of those same people, and we could tell sort of who needed a little bit more work, who needed to come back to groups and who didn't, because we went to many of the same places. And the majority of people we worked with are already integrated as volunteers. Some of them were like still a little hesitant, so we worked in a separate group with them just to get them out. They, people have certain kind of resilience. With children, Sri Lanka is mostly Buddhist. Java is mostly Muslim. Samoa is mostly Christian. So when you have all but a couple percentage in one religion, the people who take care of these emotional issues, these psychological issues, are the church or the mosque or the temples. But that's very nice for adults, but not for kids. And not to mean that the kids can't benefit from the religious teaching, but when you're 7, it really doesn't matter if it's Jesus or Allah or Buddha or what. I'm angry, or I'm afraid, or I have grief. And that's universal. All children have the same identity with the emotional body, without a religious context or a cultural context. So as adults, we also have to look at that. Some of them are simply able to kind of let it go and dissolve it because perhaps as Hindu, they may have a sense of reincarnation or past life, or as Jews, they may feel a certain way. Everybody has a cultural story that goes with it. Children don't. They don't have that framework yet, so it's much easier to get right to the emotional body.
I was thinking a lot about children that become child soldiers and they experience very traumatic things, and there's a sort of a coalescence of cultural, religious, moral breakdown that's all happening at once.
That's about as extreme as it gets in Colombia, where children have become soldiers during the Congo. Yeah, I've worked a little bit with them, not much. It's pretty extreme. I would like to go there at some point. I'm sure I will, but even going to Kenya, I'm very happy that I'm friends with Gavin, because 2 days ago I called him up and said, can you run a report on me on Kenya, because I've taken my family, I'm taking my eldest son anyway, and a couple other clinical psychologists and a physician and a trauma care worker from Israel, and I don't want to put people in harm's way. I mean, when we went to Fukushima, we had radiation detectors and all kinds of stuff. And he ran a report. Whoa, that's not what I was thinking it was. It's dangerous. And it's what's considered a moderate risk. I mean, we're not going shopping, so we're not like walking down the street. We're going to go from the hotel in a car to the schools and then back from the hotel, and so we'll be pretty low profile. In a disaster area, like after there's an earthquake, you can put on a red nose and a clown suit and run down the middle of the street and make a lot of noise. In Kenya, you can't. Working in the Congo, your life is at risk, immediately just walking in the door. And there's certain people you don't show up with, right? Certain colors of skin or certain colors of hair or certain religious beliefs, they're targets. That's what he called situational awareness.
So when you're in these places, sometimes you see a lot of horrific things or you hear horrific stories. How do you separate yourself from that to a certain extent so you don't take their baggage but can still help?
Space that goes through, but there's always like a little glue. There's always a little part of me that holds on to something. And usually on the way home, I'm a basket case, weeping and crying on the airplane. And probably for 3 or 4 or 5 days, I'm completely toast.
So it's just then letting it go through
Yeah, I don't have, nor do I believe in or support the notion that you should protect yourself with a golden light and try to do all that stuff. I'm the opposite of that. It's like, bring it. Just lay it on me. Oh, I'm open to it. It's like horrible. I get it. It's like really, really terrible. But frankly, most of the golden light stuff, which is New Age mischief, doesn't work where I go.
But I mean more while you're there, because while you're there, you're teaching and you're helping other people, so you kind of have to put it together. So how do you not let it?
90% of the time we can, and some of the times we can't, and we step out of the room. Yeah, all the people on the team, there's only 2 rules if you ever want to train and go with us. The first is that you can pay your own way, and then we'll take care of you on the ground. So get your plane ticket together, and we'll meet you there. Or you can go with us, but you buy your own plane ticket. And then we'll take care of your transportation and translation and accommodation and food, etc. But the second is that you can take care of yourself. And I don't mean that you know how to brush your teeth or that you can hold yourself together. And all the best people and all the greatest workers and all the nicest volunteers agree to that condition, and they all break down on the first day. And it's the second day that matters, right? Because it's overwhelming. It's just insane. It's too difficult. And then the second day, if you can put yourself back together, I mean, everybody does. We never had to send someone home. But the second day, you got to learn. Your heart's a little bigger, and you just go there. And different people have different techniques, I guess. Some people try the golden light or the numbing themselves out or the disassociation or whatever, but it shows up pretty quickly. You can't. You just have to be there as a human being with it. Yes?
I'm curious how you develop these tactics for dealing with trauma. Kind of like what we're doing here, trying to find different ways to intervene with something as sensitive as trauma. Was it kind of a trial and error for a while? Or?
Not terribly that. It was born out of 2 different bodies of work. One is called Bioenergetics, which was created by a man named Alexander Lowen, who's deceased, but who wrote many, many books on the world of the body, the emotional body, the energy body. He took work from Wilhelm Reich, whose work was in the psychological world about body armoring and how we protect ourselves. And the other piece for me was directly out of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the training that I did with her at End of Life, which, as I've told many people who ask me kind of how you can be with the people who are dying, it's to really genuinely have your own experience and simply be present. And that's really a challenge. It's so easy to think of a lot of other stuff. Okay? So out of those 2 bodies of work, if you will, I added my own experience as a macrobiotic counselor and teacher, which came from traditional Chinese medicine. So the exercises are actually based on what are called the 5 elements. The 5 elements are Chinese medicine's theoretical foundation. And they essentially open the lungs to oxygenate, they loosen the joints to lubricate, they release stagnation in the kidneys, they open the liver to discharge certain chemicals. And here's the cool part with it, actually the science behind it. 2 things. One is that in Sri Lanka, we had a control group of 279 children. And we worked with them over a period of time on one part of the island. And we took another control group on the other part of the island, which we didn't go to, but because the tsunami hit them in equal ways, those were kids who were all under the same circumstance as these kids were, except they didn't have our counseling. So of these 279 kids over there that we didn't work with, there were something like 37 cases of PTSD. And these kids we worked with, there were like 2. So we know something's going on, something's working. Right? It's different. Because these kids also had some psychological counseling and some crisis intervention, but it wasn't physical, it wasn't body-centered. But here's the thing. When you scream out of terror, out of fear, you release a chemical in your body. And it's the chemical that you need to release because when you're afraid and you scream, your body is basically saying, I need to survive, and I have to secrete this chemical to survive. But if you swallow that scream and you don't let it out, the chemical isn't secreted. Okay? So we know that on brain scan, and we can see that that isn't there. In Garretson Beach, after Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy here, we did some training down in Brooklyn and Garretson Beach and Breezy Point and through that region. And we did a play shop at a firehouse. Kids love firehouses. That's a safe place for them to go. So we did a training there, a play shop there. This one little boy's in our group, and beforehand I saw him kind of running around before we actually started the formal part. And I asked his mom what was up, and He said Dad is a fireman, and the night of the event, he made the kids get out of bed and put on their boots and their coats and got them out of harm's way, and then he went off to work because he had to help many other families, and he hasn't been back in a while. You know, he checks in, we know he's okay, but, you know. And so little Tommy over there is kind of like freaked out because his dad's gone. You know? So we started the play shop, and, you know, he's like kind of looking around and, you know, sort of in and out of the play shop. And then in the group, he finally kind of plants his feet in the ground, and he goes, "Ah!" and he screams with all his lungs. Right? And that's great. That's great stuff. And so the facilitator is like, you know, looking at that. Everybody in the group's like, whoa. So that begins what we call call and response. So the facilitator looked at him and he went, "Ah!" back at him, and the little boy's like, "What?" So then the little boy went, "Ah!" and raised his arms and screamed, right? And the facilitator went to the rest of the group, right? And then everybody went, "Ah!" and then we're back and forth like 4 or 5 times, right? So we found out a couple days later, that little boy who had been going to sleep with his boots on and his coat zipped up didn't anymore. Because the scream that he swallowed came out. And what happens when you scream in a situation like that, even though it isn't a real fear, you release the chemical. So when you pretend to be afraid, it works. When you pretend to be angry, you get those chemicals out. When you pretend to be sad, and you make that crying, and everybody's like leaning on, and you're sort of like kind of play acting, which kids will love to do, right? You release the same chemicals, and your brain scans regulate your body. That's the physiological change that causes the body to release those things in the tissues which would otherwise become systemic and turn into PTSD, turn into skin problems and back problems and headaches and digestive issues and all kinds of things that are a burden on a family and on a healthcare system and on workers. And, you know, I mean, the number is astounding. What did PTSD cost us in the United States last year? $42 billion. I'm sorry, that's 1990. No, I beg pardon. 1990, $42 billion. That's like 70, 80, 90 billion dollars in PTSD services, drugs, care. So for me, it's like totally unacceptable that we're just going to sit around and wait for PTSD to emerge in children. I'd rather get in and disrupt it and like not allow it to emerge and get those kids' boots off and those coats off and get them screaming because they had fun screaming.
Let's just take a couple more. I hate to, but just a couple more, and then we're at 8. Yeah.
Are there people who have regular physical practice in their life, like people who are physically active, running or working out or playing sports? Are there relationships between that and some of the stuff you're seeing since your practice is so physical? People who are more emotionally resilient or get that stuff out regularly on their own because they do.
It's a very good question, and here's the way I'd answer it. We'll see sort of how much lifestyle knowledge is in the room here. At some point, I hope that you get to this place where you can figure out really, really, really healthy ways of eating for yourself. Because you're going to find out that somewhere down the road you're going to have to pick up the tab. That's pretty much a guarantee. Right? So the sooner that you get that reality of good quality food and getting rid of the chemicals and the preservatives and the excess fats and sugars and whatever, you know, a little bit more awake you can possibly become and a little more present, etc., physical activity. Right? So among all the different kinds of diets in the world that are buzzed out there, and I don't mean diets to lose weight, I mean dietary patterns and habits, what's the sort of nice framework? How does it fit? Which diet, which culture across a particular region fits the healthy view? the healthy model, what is that?
The Mediterranean.
The Mediterranean diet. Very good. Mediterranean diet. So it turns out that the Mediterranean diet is pretty much grain, whole grain based, noodles, pasta, millet, rice, beans, lots of vegetables, lots of fruits, good quality oils, maybe a little more fish than other kinds of animal foods, right? Well, northern climates or Japanese diet, actually macrobiotic diet, looks just like that. But you don't hear so much like that about macrobiotic diet. It's the Mediterranean diet that's so good. So, why is the Mediterranean diet so great? Because when you look at the breakdown of the nutrients of selenium and calcium and vitamin B's and all these things that are in the grains and vegetables and fruits and beta-carotene and so forth, you can find that in a lot of other places. But there's something else that's going on in the Mediterranean region that doesn't happen in the northern climates or in Japan or in other regions where even though the diet is similar, the results are not the same. So what's happening there?
Sunshine?
No, it's not just climate, but the climate does help it.
Relax. Smoking cigarettes and drinking wine.
What's there? Yeah. No? Siestas? No. That's good. Good idea. The emotional expression is unstoppable. Yay! They're singing and there's passion in the opera and they're throwing plates across the room and they're fighting and they're dancing and they're twirling and they're yelling and screaming and they're kissing and making up and they're dancing. Right? They're not doing that in Japan. Right? They're not doing that in Sweden. They're not doing that in northern climates where everybody's like trying to close down. Right? So similarly, in cultures, which is the point you're making, right, that are more active, are also more expressive in terms of what happens physiologically in the body, oxygenation of the blood, elimination of carbon dioxide, the regulation of cortisol, the stimulation of the hippocampus in the center of the brain, the signals that go to the hypothalamus, all that physiological stuff that we know that is the basis of trauma and the basis of PTSD eventually is mitigated by much more physical activity and emotional expression. So you want to follow the Mediterranean diet, that's great, but you also need to go to opera, and you need to sing, and you need to dance, and you need to make a joyful noise, just like it says in the Bible, right? Because the diet alone is just your body, right? And you've got something else going on up here. And correspondingly, it's not just about what you think, right? Because you've got the biological reality of what you're putting in your digestive system and feeding. So both are there, absolutely. And I'm sure there are studies, I'm not familiar with them, which would suggest there's greater resilience in cultures that have more physicality, more expression. But I certainly know in terms of longevity and the lack of degenerative disease in Mediterranean cultures, it isn't just because of the food. Okay? It's because of the lifestyle and the physical expression, emotional expression. So I think one last question, and then we're going to get you out of here. Yes?
Can PTSD be contagious in the sense that if you spend a lot of time, let's say with a significant other or a child or someone who's suffered a lot of trauma, you're involved in their own trauma kind of through them, can that affect you profoundly?
Yeah, there's something actually called secondary stress disorder. It's much more easily resolved, but it is a certain kind of trauma. We all have secondary stress disorder for a while, but some people are a little bit more kind of clairsentient or empathic and really take it on. Right? My wife is like that. She sort of inhales other people's emotion and can't be around too much disorder. She does not come with me. She would not make it out the door. Right? I mean, she cries at Lassie, like that. Oh, Jimmy fell in the well, So people are like that. They have different sensitivities. But if you're living in a family situation or you're constantly in the line of fire of someone who's under trauma, you can get secondary trauma disorder. thank you for the opportunity. Hope to see you.